room, so you're able to step in and take photos of them. On this side is the parlor. So just like the doors were open for you today, they would have been open for you in the 18th century. They would have been opened by you by footmen, mainly enslaved individuals wearing a certain uniform called a livery, which is on the other side. You're going to be then greeted by the governor's secretary. He's going to want to know what is your business. Because most Virginians never made it past this archway. So he's going to ask you, most likely you're going to deal with him. He's going to send you back out the door. You can probably not even see the governor. So inside the parlor there, if you go in and look to your right, you will see Lord Dunmore's tall case clock, or what we know as a grandfather clock, and a couple other original pieces on the mantle. It also would have been used for afternoon tea or a small entertainment space if you're going to play cards in the evening. On the other side, we have the butler's pantry. Those doors actually would have been closed off, because if you look over to your right, you'll see a side door there. So all the deliveries for the palace are coming in through that door. So the head housekeeper, butler, they're going to have that desk. They're answering that door. They're keeping an eye on all those expensive items in there, including the silver that you see to your left. They're also maintaining the account books for the palace, including paying paid servants. Lord Dunmore brought 22 paid white servants with him. There were 12 indentured servants, and then those 57 enslaved individuals that are doing more of the labor. So folks, feel free to look in those spaces and then come back to this room and we'll talk about this space. The many weapons. And now you understand why I said that the gentlemen in particular need to look with their eyes and not their hands, right? Yes, so it was custom to have an arms display like this. It served a couple purposes. So you're coming in as if Lord Dunmore's still here. We're still very much British. We haven't, well, the Burgess has been canceled a couple times under Lord Botetourt. Lord Dunmore has done the same. So there is a lot of friction, but we're still very much British. So we come in, we would feel a lot of pride, know that we have the best military back in the world, the best Navy. But imagine if you're one of those Shawnee hostages coming in, if you're a delegate from the Cherokee Nation or France or Spain, or Washington came here very often. He visited with Lord Dunmore. He actually went on hunting trips with him. But of course, Washington came with his manservant, William Lee, an enslaved person. So how might any of those people feel?
Very nervous.
Nervous, intimidated, scared, absolutely. So they serve that purpose as well. So there are 540 weapons here in the palace. 80 of the muskets are original to the time. The bottom 4 here above the mantle that are lighter in color, those are reproductions. All of the swords are reproductions. Swords are kind of a throwaway item. They don't last. You use them, they break, you're done. A man who becomes our 5th president, James Monroe, he does fight in the Revolution, by Washington's side. He was shot in his shoulder. But he's one of the people that breaks in after Lord Dunmore flees with a few other individuals. They take all the weapons out and they put them in the magazine. That's how we know how many are here. So folks, what do you think the most expensive item in this room is?
The crest.
No? Good guess.
The floor.
It's the mantle.
Well, it's not the mantle, but what is the mantle made out of?
The marble.
Marble. Look at the floor.
Yeah.
So it's actually the floor. So the white marble from England, the black from Belgium. Most Virginians, their homes might have been as large as this room. Most likely not. What do you think their floors were made out of?
Dirt.
Dirt. Absolutely, yes. So quite a shocker how lavish that is. And of course that served that purpose, to make sure you know who has the wealth, who's in power. So as we go into the ballroom, we're going to pass a few rooms. So as you came in, it's kind of closed off today because they're doing some recordings. But the scullery and the kitchen, that's where they're doing all the food prep. So the enslaved individuals are going to bring it in through that side door. It's going to come into the warming room. So where they're bringing it in, they're going to put it on prettier plates before they take it to the dining room. Dining room also serves as the governor's office. Lord Botetourt, who's here before Lord Dunmore, he has 3 desks in that room. I still don't understand. But, I don't understand, do you have bird cages in your pantry? No, it's one of those bell symbols, right? We actually have Lord Dunmore's desk in there. And then we will pass the powder room. What do you think the powder room is for?
Bathing.
Actually, well, it would be for powdering your wigs.
Okay.
No bathing inside here, but yes, and storage. So folks, we're gonna head on into the ballroom, so please follow me. Were additions while Dinwiddie was our governor. So he was actually one of the few governors appointed, royal governors appointed, that actually was here in the colony before he was appointed as governor. Didn't normally happen. Most governors had never been here before. So imagine coming to a new place and you have no one on your side. I think that's okay too. So when you come in, of course, we notice how tall the ceilings are. This wonderful Prussian blue, it's one of my favorites. And wall-to-wall carpeting. Very unusual at the time, but if you're coming into the ballroom, what are you coming in here for? Dancing! So if you're dancing the minuet with leather-soled shoes, the carpet's actually going to be a little nicer on your feet. So it is a Wilton carpet patterned from the time based on mosaics found in Pompeii. So I cannot imagine being the one either to clean it or be the one who had to sew it together and tack it to the floor. No thank you. So, and of course we have our chandeliers in the room. So you asked me about that closet, so that broom closet where you're storing that ladder first, you're gonna have to bring it in so you can light those candles way out there. So the middle luster here is actually an original. And the ballroom wouldn't be complete without reminding you who was in charge, the monarchy. So as you came through that door, if you look above it, you see the initials GR. You'll also see them on the weather vane. They stand for Georgius Rex or King George. So on this side, we have the 1660s Lely Studio portraits of King Charles II, his wife Catherine of Braganza. She's a Portuguese princess. She does not become queen because she's Catholic. However, she is one of the reasons why we're actually drinking tea in the British Empire. And then on this side, we have the 1760s coronation portraits of King George III, who's on the throne when we go to fight for our independence, and his wife Charlotte of Mecklenburg. He is 22 and she is 16 in those portraits. They end up having 15 children together. Yes. That was my reaction to it. I was like, wait, what? Yes. So one of the last royal balls held here was actually held in January 1775. It was known that it got cold enough for Virginia for the James River to freeze because they did get the ice from there for the ice house or the mount. So we would need heat in here. So in the other spaces, you saw the fireplaces. In here, we have the Dutch warming machine. Lord Batatat orders 3 of them, 2 for here, 1 for the Capitol. Of course, the Capitol, one of those buildings had burned too. Here. See again, Virginians like to burn things. So that actually runs on coal. So very, very hot, pretty close to there, not so much in the other spaces, but you're gonna have over 60 people in here. And from very early on in your life, as part of the gentry, the top 1%, you're learning your deportment skills, which are learning how to stand up properly, how your courtesies, how you're bowing for ladies or gentlemen. And of course, part of that is actually dancing. But what do you need to dance? Music, absolutely. So we actually have a bureau organ there, which just looks like a weird case. And then the harpsichord here. This one is from 1758. It's actually one of my most favorite sounds. I can't personally play it, but I can press a magic button so you can listen to it. So I'm going to do that. From dusk till dawn, but you're also using the garden space. It's going to be another focal point for entertaining because not everyone can have such an elaborate garden. So they would have a gardener on staff knowledgeable in horticulture, but who's doing the manual labor? The enslaved people. And I like to point out that 4 of our first 5 presidents are Virginians. They own enslaved people. So while they are either fighting in the revolution or they are a politician working towards documents for our independence, who is running their homes? Enslaved people. They can't do what they do without that workforce. That's what builds their wealth. James Madison states that he knows it's morally wrong to own enslaved people. However, he knows his wealth is dependent on it. He even plays the system when he has his manservant in Philadelphia. Keeps him there, and instead of sending him back because he knew they would poison the mind of the other enslaved people at Montpelier, he puts him in indentured servitude. Washington is also one of the first people to have a fugitive slave force, as one of his enslaved people runs away when they're in Philadelphia, and he was determined to hunt them down, not successful. So something to definitely think about. While you're in Williamsburg, you're not going to see enslaved people's living quarters because they're living where they're working. They're mainly domestics or they're in the trades. So if you want to learn more about them, definitely go to the Randolph or the Witt property. What you're not going to see here is there was also a 200-acre working farm and greenhouses here. So a lot was happening here on site, very much working every day. But they still had to go to the market to buy butter. Even Washington has still had to go to the market to buy butter. That one baffles me. You have cattle. What are you doing, right?
Yep.
But 18th century people are very much consumers like we are. They like to shop. They don't make their clothes. They go to the mantua maker, the milliner, the tailor, and they buy things. You're not making them here in an urban center. So folks, I did say this building burned down while it's being used as a hospital. During the archaeological work, they did find a mass grave. So on the other side of this wall here, you'll see a green space. It's kind of blocked off. Doesn't really look like much. There's a plaque there that lets you know there's about 150 so soldiers and 2 women we believe were nurses. So all casualties of the Battle of Yorktown are buried on the property. Do you folks have questions for me? I know it's a lot of information. And you're like, whew. So unfortunately, you weren't able to go on the second floor today, but you can go online and look at the virtual tour so you can at least see the bed chambers. And there's an upper middle room.
Have done with powder and potion, bolus and pill, that hangman with noose, or soldier with gun, or miser with famine, or lawyer with quill. To dispatch us the quicker, forbid us malt liquor, till our bodies consumed and our faces grow pale. But mind, for it pleases, and it cures all diseases, it's comforting, barrel and Nottingham ale. Nottingham ale, boys, Nottingham ale. No liquor on earth is like Nottingham ale. Nottingham ale, boys, Nottingham ale. No liquor on earth is like Nottingham ale. So let us now our sins down tread, and joyfully all appear. Let's merry be this day, and let us now both sport and play. Hang grief, cast cares away, God send us a happy new year. And with each New Year's gift that friends unto each other now does send, in hope that we our lives amend, and joyously now appear. Now, like the snake, your skin, cast off all the evil thought and sin, and let the year begin. God send us a happy new year. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day, to save us all from Satan's power when we had gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. From God our Heavenly Father, a blessed angel came, and unto certain shepherds brought tidings of the same, how that in Bethlehem was born the Son of God by name. For tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. For tidings of comfort and joy.
As I was wending my way hither, down the main street, the memories of this birthplace of American liberty were flooding through my mind. I spent about a third of my life either coming to or leaving from Williamsburg, indeed even lived amongst you for 3 years when I was serving as governor back in the middle 70s. First time I arrived here was in 1760 to receive my law certificate. I did not set out in life to become an attorney. In fact, my father desired that my brother William and I first become shopkeepers and then later tobacco merchants. Alas, 2 different attempts at a country store both failed. And not, as my detractors would have you believe, because I'm more given to invective than to inventory. Those were very difficult years throughout the Old Dominion. Well, you recall, sir, there were 3 consecutive years of drought in the middle 50s. Tobacco failed miserably. And as tobacco was our money, why, a great many enterprises were not successful. If anything, my brother and I were simply guilty of being overly generous in extending credit towards our neighbors, who otherwise must have starved. But to further complicate matters for me in my early life, and I married rather young by most Virginia standards. I was but 18, my dear Sally, now deceased, 16. Our fathers were initially opposed to the union, for after all, I'd not yet made anything of myself. I was a failed storekeeper, for heaven's sake. But they finally relented, and upon our nuptials we were granted 300 acres of land in Hanover County at Pine Slash, and 6 very young, inexperienced Negro slaves. The farm was never productive from the start, owing no doubt to previous years of planting tobacco. Tobacco is a miserable plant in that regard. It depletes the soil of all of its goodness and fertility after only a couple of generations. To further complicate matters, our farmhouse burned and almost all of our possessions with it when the roof collapsed the following morning. So, just to have some shelter above my family's heads, we had 2 small children at that time, in exchange for a private room at my father-in-law's tavern, Hanover Tavern, I began to work for him, managing the premises in his absences, keeping the bar, playing at fiddle even, if that was required. Hanover Tavern sits just opposite the road from Hanover Courthouse, and thus in this manner I rather quickly became acquainted with many of the lawyers who were riding the county circuit. That is to say, by day they would argue law in the courthouse, and by night would argue more loudly in the tavern. And after a time I began to think that I too might be well suited to that particular profession, for my mother claimed until her passing that I have a gift from God for argument. So I borrowed as many law books as I could lay my hands upon, which was 3. Read them in 6 weeks' time when I made that fateful journey here to Williamsburg to stand for my examinations. In order to become a licensed attorney in Virginia, one must undergo 2 very grueling 3-hour-long oral examinations on the 4 points of law and receive 2 signatures upon his law certificate. The men who administer these examinations are commonly the men who are certified to profess law in the General Court, the Supremist Court in Virginia, which in those days, of course, was in the Capitol building at the top of the hill. So the first gentleman to whom I applied was Mr. Peyton Randolph. He resided here upon the back street and would subsequently become the Speaker of the House of Burgesses and ultimately the first President of the Grand Congress in Philadelphia. In fact, he died while in that office. I explained to him that I had read law by myself, not with a mentor, which is the common practice, and that I had done so in a rather short period of time, and I think my appearance may have had something to do with his reaction too, for being from the backwoods as I am, I'm always most comfortable clad in greasy leather buckskin breeches and a hunting frock, and I was all dusty from that long ride from Hanover. He promptly shut the door in my face. Not to be undone, I then applied to Mr. Robert Carter Nicholas, who would later become the treasurer of both the colony and the Commonwealth of Virginia. He had the same reaction as did Mr. Randolph. By this time I was becoming a little bit anxious, but with a little bit of assistance from my young friend, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was reading law with George Wythe here upon the Palace Green, I was able to gain entry to Mr. Wythe's home. He was suitably impressed with my legal arguments, but with some reluctance signed my certificate, making me first to promise that I would return home and continue to read municipal law, as my knowledge of it was rather weak after such a short period of time of study. But armed with his signature, I was able to gain entry to Mr. John Randolph over on England Street, who was also rather impressed with my legal arguments. In fact, he paid to me a very great compliment that day as he signed. He said to me, "After this day, Mr. Henry, I will never again trust to appearances." So I went home, and I became a lawyer, licensed in 4 different counties, Louisa, Hanover, Goochland, and Cumberland, and began riding the county circuit. Here in Virginia, we deliberately stagger the dates that courts are open for business in order to allow an attorney to go from courthouse to courthouse. In other words, Louisa County's court would meet the first Tuesday of each month. Excuse me, Hanover County, the adjacent county, the first Friday of each month, and so forth. And I was busy for those first 3 years, handling no less than 3,000 different legal matters, nothing of great import, licenses, wills, deeds, petty disputes having to do with borders or boundaries or debt. And then, in December of 1763, came my big break, the Parsons cause. Now, to refresh you, friends, in those days under royal authority, we had a state church, Church of England, which required, among other things, that all heads of household had to pay an annual tithe, or a tax, to support the local Church of England parish and that one church alone. And much of those monies were applied to the salary of the established clergymen in that parish. Our clergymen were living quite well in those days, too. By law, receiving 16,000 pounds of tobacco per year in order to fulfill their ministerial responsibilities. Now, when translated into money, tobacco in those days generally sold for 2 pence per pound. So the 16,000 pounds of tobacco would translate into 144 pounds Virginia current money. A gentleman's income. Make no mistake. By contrast, I dare say that even today, these 30 years later, most of the storekeepers here in Williamsburg are very happy to make 90 pounds in a year's time. So our clergy were living quite well. Because of the short crop that I mentioned earlier, however, from 1755 to 58, the price of tobacco in the world exchange tripled to 6 pence per pound. And the House of Burgesses realized very quickly on that if we continue to pay our clergy and other public servants 16,000 pounds a year, it is going to bankrupt our society. And so they passed a law known as the Two-Penny Act, which declared that for the time of that emergency only, our clergy and other public servants would not be paid in tobacco, but rather would be paid in money, and that they would be paid at the rate of 2 pence per pound, which tobacco had always sold for. In other words, they were making the same amount of income they always had. Well, one of them, the Reverend John Cam, commissary at the College of William and Mary, believed that he and his fellows were being cheated. And so he sailed to Great Britain and appealed before the King, the Privy Council, and the Board of Trade to have the Two-Penny Act nullified or overturned, which the King did. The Reverend Cam then returned to Virginia, spread the word amongst his fellow rapacious harpies, and they began to bring lawsuits against all of the vestries as well as the sheriffs, our tax collectors, suing generally for 288 pounds in current money in damages. The second time that this particular legal cause was heard had to do with the Reverend Mr. John Mowry of Trinity Parish in Louisa County suing Thomas Johnson, the sheriff of Louisa, for 288 pounds. Mr. Johnson's initial hire of attorney resigned, thinking there's no point to this. The King nullified the Two-Penny Act. They're going to get everything they're asking for. It's a waste of time. And so he resigned. I was taken on as a last-minute afterthought. I found my gift that day. I harangued the jury for well more than an hour's time, painting the clergy in such a disgraceful, despicable, and avaricious light that the jury was so horrified they retired for only a minute or two to the jury room before they returned with their verdict. And they awarded the Reverend Mr. Mowry not 288 pounds, but rather 1 penny in damages. That set a precedent. In fact, the courtroom at the time was packed with clergymen from other parishes, no doubt eagerly awaiting to see what kind of monies they could expect when their own lawsuits came about. But they realized very quickly after I got done with them that there was no way that they could win this one, at least not in the court of public opinion. And so they began to drop their lawsuits throughout the whole of the Old Dominion. I became something of a hero that day, especially to the small dirt farmer who would have been most affected if this had gone on. Shortly after the verdict, I approached the Reverend Mr. Mowry and apologized to him for some of the rough things I'd said about the clergy that day, but at the same time, with a wink, I said, "But this case has made me famous." Sure enough, I was picked up upon the shoulders of a crowd of men and paraded around the courtyard electioneering style, and the following year found myself elected for the first time into that pile of bricks at the top of the hill as one of the burgesses representing the good people of Louisa County. I do think I had a couple of advantages working to my advantage that day. For one thing, the venue of the trial had changed from Louisa County Courthouse, which was undergoing repairs from a lightning strike the week before, and it was moved to Hanover County, where my father, Colonel John Henry, happened to be the Chief Justice of the Hanover County Court. I suppose it also helped a little bit that having been born in Hanover County, I knew that at least 8 of the jurymen were Presbyterians and not too terribly excited about paying an annual tax to support a church to which they themselves did not subscribe. Well, I took my seat for the first time in the House of Burgesses in 1765. It was the time of the hated Stamp Act, and almost immediately I ruffled a great many feathers here in Williamsburg, and many still resent me for it. You know, the traditions of the House are such, where a freshman Burgess is not expected to cause any stir nor sensation. Rather, he's supposed to sit on the back bench, on his hands, not speak, give his vote when and how he's told to do so by his betters. Well, I'd only sworn the oath of office for the first time 8 days prior to introducing my Stamp Act resolutions, which, in the words of my friend Jefferson, set the impetus to the ball of revolution rolling down the hill. Even though we ultimately only passed 4 of the 7, with 5, 6, and 7 being deemed too incendiary or inflammatory in terms of the language, with the 7th and final one actually accusing the king himself of being an enemy to this, His Majesty's most sovereign colony of Virginia. So even though we passed 4 of the 7, as if by magic, by some miracle, all 7 resolutions appeared in newspapers to the far north as Rhode Island and to the far south as Savannah. And you see, the effect of this was it made the people of Virginia, and me in particular, appear to be far bolder than we really were. But it got people speaking with one collective voice for the first time. Oh, make no mistake, the British government had deliberately kept these colonies separate and apart from one from another, because that way they knew we would be very weak. But if we spoke with one voice, we could wield a formidable sword indeed. The next 10 years would find me coming every year to Williamsburg to serve in the House. For the first part, the good people of Louisa County, and then later, and towards the end, Hanover County, and served until the House of Burgesses was no more. During that time, I was also very proud to represent all Virginia at the first 2 sessions of the Grand Congress in Philadelphia City. I served as the first Commander-in-Chief of the Virginia line for a period of time. And imagine my surprise when, during the 5th Virginia Convention, after we drafted our Declaration of Rights and wrote a new Constitution, despite the great resentment held for me because of my influence in those days, I was still elected to serve as the first governor of the Commonwealth from 1776 to 1779, and thus at that time was living amongst you in the governor's mansion. And the capital moved to Richmond, of course, the next year, and I haven't been back since, until this day. I will confess to you, though, my friends, I am very deeply concerned about the future of our country, and I'm not alone. I recently received a word from my old friend, President Washington, who reminded me of some of the crises that we have faced as a nation since we entered into this national system of government. He reminded me, for example, of the terrible plague that afflicted so many cities. The yellow fever literally decimated the population of Philadelphia. Half the population evacuated, those who were able to do so, including the Congress and the President himself. Those who remained behind either died or were perpetrating looting upon their neighbors who were at the time absent. And it came so close as to Williamsburg as Alexandria, spreading throughout all of the countryside. Cure is still unknown. He reminded me also of the fact that we've had a couple of rebellions since we formed into this national government. Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, whereby Federal troops were actually in the field of battle against armed American citizens over taxation. He reminded me, too, of the rise of these democratical societies, as they're called. They're Frenchmen, such as Citizen Genet, who were doing everything they can to undermine whichever administration might be in power at the time, for both Washington and currently President Adams. And the Adams administration has retaliated by passing a couple of laws known as the Alien and Sedition laws, which in effect are contrary to everything we struggled against Great Britain about. Because of the democratical societies, now Messrs. Jefferson and Madison have determined that we've changed our minds. This in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. We've decided that if the Congress enacts a law that we don't like, we don't have to abide by it. We can nullify it. There's no clause of nullification in the Constitution, as I warned them 10 years ago. And now, because of the turmoil presently taking place in Congress, Massachusetts and New York have both threatened secession. In short, we're on the verge of disunion. And so my old friend continued, I know that you won't consider any federal office. You've refused so many already, but will you at least do this? Will you at least throw your name in for nomination to the General Assembly of Virginia and use the reverence and the affection that the people of Virginia still have for you to keep Virginia in the Union? For as Virginia goes, so goes the Union. Well, I've been thinking about it on this ride from the Green Sea. I'm in happy retirement. And yet, at the same time, my children would blush to know that General Washington and I were contemporaries, and that I refused his request to throw my mile in for the public good. I've determined that it's time once again for me to put my actions where my words are. In fact, I was reminded of the first day of the first Congress at which General Washington and I served together. It was the first day, the 5th of September, 1774. Rather awkward. Here we all were from different parts of the continent, nothing of us having anything in common, in Carpenter's Hall, rather awkward. And finally, one of the gentlemen from New Hampshire raised up his hand, Bartlett, and he said, well, gentlemen, we've come all this way to Philadelphia. I suppose we should accomplish something. How, for example, are we going to reach decisions? Are we going to vote? And if we do, are we all going to have equal voice? Or will Virginia, the most populous and the wealthiest of us, have greater influence than, say, little Rhode Island? And that's when the bickering and the squabbling began. All these petty jealousies exposed for everyone to see. And fearful that we were going to disband as a Congress before we got anything done, I desired to take the floor and raised a great many eyebrows when I said, gentlemen, government is dissolved. A time of crisis is clearly now at hand. Fleets and armies come to our shores, clear evidence of this crisis. At this time, therefore, all distinctions must be thrown down. The distinction, I said, between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders is no more. I am not a Virginian. I am an American. I believe the time has come that we should all consider those sentiments once again, as we are perilously close to disunion at this current time. And I would urge you to have a word with your own elected representatives, to share my words with them, and with the hope that this union will stay together. Let us not split into factions, which must certainly ruin or destroy this union upon which our very existence hangs. Let us instead save our strength for the English, the French, the Germans, and not exhausted in civil commotions. The motto of the First Congress stands today: united we stand, divided we fall. Well, prattled on long enough, I suppose, about my personal